What if the reason you prefer being alone isn't a personality trait? What if it's a pattern, one that started in childhood without you even noticing? Because some of the most independent people aren't naturally that way. They were trained. And once you see why, you can't unsee it. Insecure attachment. When closeness feels unpredictable. Imagine growing up not knowing which version of your parent you'll get. Some days they're warm, other days distant, unreachable, cold. There's no consistency, and your brain learns something important. Connection isn't safe. This is insecure attachment. When love feels unpredictable, you don't run toward it. You start pulling away from it. Not because you don't want connection, but because inconsistency feels like a risk. Over time, you adapt. You become someone who enjoys people, but in small amounts. You keep emotional distance without realizing it. You feel most calm when alone, because alone is stable. Alone doesn't suddenly change. When your emotions were ignored, there's a quieter kind of childhood experience that leaves no obvious scars, but shapes everything. It's when your emotions weren't truly seen. You were upset, but told you were overreacting. You tried to explain, but got dismissed. You needed someone to listen, but no one really did. So eventually you stop. You stop explaining, you stop expressing, you stop expecting. Your brain makes a rule: handle everything alone. As an adult, this shows up subtly. You rarely open up emotionally. You process everything internally. You don't instinctively reach out when things get hard. Instead, you withdraw. Not because you don't need support, but because you learned it wouldn't be there. Forced emotional independence too early. Some people didn't choose independence. They were pushed into it. As a child, you had to handle your own problems, calm yourself down, figure things out, alone. And from that, a belief forms. I can only rely on myself. On the surface, this looks like strength. You're capable, responsible, self-sufficient. But underneath, there's discomfort with vulnerability, discomfort with needing help, discomfort with depending on others. Because in your experience, needing help didn't feel safe. It felt like being ignored or becoming a burden, so you adapted, you stopped needing, or at least you convinced yourself you did. And being alone, it doesn't feel empty, it feels controlled. But here's where most people misunderstand. Choosing to be alone doesn't always mean someone is avoiding life. Sometimes it's the only place they've ever felt regulated. Social overload. When silence feels like recovery. Not everyone experiences the world the same way. For some people, being around others isn't just socializing. It's stimulation, constant input, voices, expectations, emotions, energy. And if you grew up in an environment that already felt overwhelming, arguments, tension, pressure, unpredictability, your nervous system adapted. It became more alert, more sensitive, more easily drained. So instead of seeking more interaction, you started seeking relief. And that relief came from being alone. Because alone means no pressure to perform, no need to read the room, no emotional noise to process, just quiet, just space, just enough distance for your mind to finally slow down. For you, solitude isn't avoidance. It's recovery. High sensitivity, feeling everything, all at once. Some people are simply wired differently. From a young age, they feel more deeply, more intensely, more frequently. In psychology, this is called being a highly sensitive person. But growing up like this isn't always easy. You notice subtle changes in tone. You pick up on tension others ignore. You absorb emotions, even when they're not yours. And as a child, that can be overwhelming, especially if no one teaches you how to process those feelings. So you find your own way, you step back, you spend time alone, you create space to think, to reset, to breathe. Because without that space, everything becomes too much. As an adult, this pattern stays. You don't avoid people. You just limit exposure. Because your inner world needs time to rebalance. The difference between being alone and being lonely. This is where most people get it wrong. Being alone is not the same as being lonely. Loneliness is the pain of lacking connection. But choosing to be alone, that's different. That's intentional. That's control. Many people who prefer solitude are still fully capable of deep connection. They can love, they can care, they can build meaningful relationships, but they are selective, careful, because they've learned not everyone is safe. So instead of constantly seeking connection, they choose it on their terms, at their pace, with people who feel right. The real story, when you put all of this together, it starts to change the narrative completely. Maybe being alone was never the problem. Maybe it was the solution. You were not born wanting to be alone. You adapted into it because at some point, being alone felt safer than being misunderstood, safer than being ignored, safer than being let down. Your mind did exactly what it was supposed to do. It protected you. And that's the part most people miss. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not distant. You are not incapable of connection. You are someone who learned how to survive emotionally without depending on others. And that takes strength. The trade-off. But here's the hard truth. The same patterns that protected you can also limit you. Because when you stop needing people, you also stop letting them in. So the real question isn't, why do I like being alone? The real question is, do I choose solitude or do I default to it? Because those are not the same thing. Choice feels calm. Default feels automatic, invisible, and often unquestioned. This doesn't mean you need to suddenly become more social or force yourself into constant interaction. That's not the goal. The goal is awareness. To understand when you're alone because you want to be and when you're alone because it feels safer. Once you see the difference, you gain something powerful. Choice. The truth about solitude. Solitude is not a flaw. For some people, it's where they think clearly, where they feel grounded, where they reconnect with themselves. But it shouldn't be the only place you feel safe. You deserve connection that doesn't drain you. You deserve people who don't make you feel like a burden. You deserve relationships where you don't have to shrink yourself just to stay. And maybe you were never too distant. You were just protecting yourself in the only way you knew how. Now that you understand it, you don't just have to survive it. You can choose something different.